Well, we welcome in the panel discussion, Detrans 101, What You Need to Know. I know Helena, Sinead, Grace and Carol are going to be part of this, so you can unmute yourselves. And I suppose the big concept, and anybody else who wants to join in, make your voice known, please do. But the big question for this is what each of you want people to know. What do people need to know about detransition? And it can go any which way. So maybe Sinead, would you kick it off? You look like you're ready with something to say. Go on then.
Just the face I have, Stella. I mean, I think one thing that we really do need to get out of the way initially is that I think most of the people that are here detransition because of transition regret related issues, but obviously that's not the only reason why people detransition. And I know we're going to get hit with that, so I'll just go ahead and get that out of the way. There's so many reasons why people detransition. Sometimes, in fact, we'll go with the studies. We'll go with the Lisa Lippman study and the Ellie Vandenbush study. The most common reasons for detransitions in those instances was realizing that your gender dysphoria was related to other issues. It was due to health concerns that would come with the steps of transition. And it was also due to, very commonly, I don't know if it was the most common, but very common, was realizing that internalized homophobia or misogyny had something to do with it. But there's also people who detransition indeed because of transphobia and because of discrimination and things like that. There's lots of reasons. And so what detransition is, in its simplest boiled down component, is someone who has began medical transition and for a reason decided to cease that. But for me, I think what we would be talking about today, what I would like the people listening to hear about today, is it's not just ending the medical process, it's also returning to a previous identity. And in a lot of cases, I won't speak for anyone here, but I know you're probably very much on the same page as me, it's giving up the trans identity, So at one point, everyone thinks about the hormones and the surgeries and things like that. That's not the whole point. The internal process that you go through is huge, and it can rule your life. It's like for me, and it was an obsession for years. And so detransition for me wasn't just stopping cross-sex hormones and stuff like that. It was letting go of a mindset that I had adopted where I believed that I wasn't a woman. So I think, sort of to kick things off, if anyone else would like to jump in and say anything else, is detransition is a lot of different things, but what's the baseline? That's mine.
Whoa. So, come on in, Carol.
Okay, so for me, I really think the core to detransition is a recognition of reality again. It's a recognition of your reality and just of the reality. And your reality is, I'll speak from my perspective. My reality was that I was a woman, I was female. My reality was that I was a lesbian. My reality was I am a butch lesbian. All those things I ran from since I was a kid and never had it addressed and never dealt with those issues. And the trans identity that I was really had the brain of a man in a woman's body just fits so nicely, because if you look at the DSM, what's most of the criteria? It's your likes, your dislikes, how you dress, just all those really superficial things. And butch lesbians especially, we tick so many of those boxes, and we always have from such a young age. It is no wonder so many of us has fallen into trans ID and transition. But for me, the core of it is acknowledging your reality and being humble about it, and then moving forward from there.
It strikes me as it's a loss of faith, though, because if you've believed something and then you don't, you're kind of in a very, I would imagine, a shaky place.
It's painful. It's very painful to the beginning.
It's that feeling, isn't it, where you find out detransition is an option, but you're so afraid to do it, and it takes such a long time to be able to admit to yourself that you were wrong, because it's embarrassing and you feel ashamed and you feel guilty. And in many cases, you lose all the friends that you had because all your friends are trans, and then you detransition and you're seen as a heretic somewhat. And you don't want to detransition. You don't want to admit that you were wrong. You don't want to be a woman with a beard or a man with breasts. You don't want to lose all your friends. You don't want people to be hostile to you and accuse you of being a bigot while you're also dealing with transition regret, which, as many of you here know all too well, it's a living hell, especially when none of your therapists or counselors will listen to you, especially when you do actually find someone who isn't completely against detransition and their response is, maybe you're gender fluid, maybe you're non-binary. It's so, detransition isn't fun and it's not enjoyable. And I completely understand why so many people lost in transition say it took me a year, 2 years, 5 years, because why the hell would you want to do it sooner?
I knew for a year before I actually stopped the process that I made a mistake. But I couldn't bring myself, I really, the biggest part was I couldn't tell my family that. I put them through so much. I couldn't go, it seems so ridiculous to go, oops, I made this huge goddamn mistake. And that was devastating. That was the hardest thing. If it would just been me, would have been much easier, in my opinion, for me. But the impact it had on my family was horrible.
Could I ask, when you said there was a year, did you continue to take the hormones for a year, or yeah?
Yep.
I done that as
I did.
well. I think that's
Did
actually quite common. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
I knew. I became gender critical. I became critical of the whole thing. But I continued taking the hormones because I felt really stuck. I didn't know what to do.
Wow.
And I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to go. Where do I go? I didn't know anybody who detransitioned. I hadn't heard even about it. And I had brought it up to my therapist many times when I had been seeing her that I had questions, I had concerns, and she didn't want to talk about it. I could definitely tell she didn't want to talk about it. So we never talked about it.
What do you think, Grace?
Yeah, I think the piece about it being not just a loss of like your, like dealing with the medical changes, but also dealing with an entire context of your personal life and your belief system is really, really painful. And I think it is very understandable to me that like Sinead and Carol stayed transitioning for some time after some part of them had realized it was a mistake, because there's so much like cognitive dissonance already, at least that I was experiencing through the whole process. And also, there's a lot of stuff within trans culture that's about managing that, like about like soothing the worry that you might not be trans, or like, being like, no, you are valid, like it's real. And it's, which to me says that a lot of trans people struggle with these sorts of doubts and like confusion, and then to push through that and slowly be having the realization that it might be wrong dawning on you, and like desperately not wanting it to be true, is extremely painful. And I think often I'd be curious how often people feel this way. I think there's often just some sort of like moment of like undeniability that I hear detransitioners talking about, like some sort of like, oh fuck moment, being like, I can't deny it anymore. I don't know. I remember lying awake one night and like being unable to sleep, and just having all my doubts just crashing down upon me, and just kind of throwing up the white flag, being like, okay, I accept it. Like I ruined my life. This was wrong. And it was devastating, but I couldn't deny it anymore. It was very powerful. So yes, so detransition is hard, and it's not just about the medical stuff.
Is there anything anybody can do if you see somebody who seems to be lost in transition and could be having those dark nights of the soul in the middle of the night? You can almost see it, that they would be having it. I wonder, is there anything you can say to them?
They need a therapist that will listen to them. If you go to your therapist and say that you're starting to struggle with some feelings of regret, And, you know, maybe you don't use the word detransition. Maybe you say something instead like, I'm considering going back, quote unquote. Your therapist should be able to listen to that. What they shouldn't do is say, you know, well, maybe it's because you have another identity, you know, maybe it's because of transphobia, maybe it's because of discrimination. And all the 5 years that I was trans identified, I never once experienced transphobia. I was celebrated and I was held up as beautiful and brave. Never once did I experience discrimination until I detransitioned. And the first people to treat me poorly were my therapists, because they just didn't want to speak about detransition. I needed help. I'm so fortunate that I have wonderful friends and family, including many of the people attending this that I've spoken to. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have anyone when those therapists done that, because you're already at rock bottom. And when you hear a certifiable or whatever qualified mental health professional being like, I don't know what detransition is, like it's a kick in the stomach. It really, really feels bad.
Whoa.
You know, I hate to say this because I was at one point on track to become a therapist. I really believed in the mental health field. And this whole experience, it's weird for me to say this, but I would really tell somebody to not go to a therapist, not seek it, because I tried every therapist I could under my insurance, and everyone was horrible to me because I came in angry. At the time, I was very angry. I was angry that I felt lied to. I felt betrayed. I felt that a lot of homophobia had taken place from everybody, but definitely from the therapist I had at the time. And I got one therapist actually tried to convince me that I was not correct in my assumption of what was going on, and that she knew for a fact that transition was excellent because she was actively transitioning a 4-year-old girl. I lost it with her. I yelled at her. I gave her hell. And I felt, you know what? She fucking deserves it. And I walked out and I sat in my truck and I sobbed. I broke down like you would not believe. I had shaking. I had to call my wife and she had to talk me through it so I could drive home. It was fucking devastating. And
Whoa.
I will, yeah, so I wonder, I would say, try to find some community, try to find some other detransitioners. You know, if you start becoming active in some of these communities, you will find, in my opinion, more help than you ever will from a therapist. Unless you can find a therapist you know is going to be supportive. And I'm not saying they're not out there. Obviously, here's Stella, but they are hard to find.
Well, I'll back you up. I became a therapist because I trailed around in my 20s, going from what I believe were one terrible therapist to the next. And I suppose the big difference is I think so many of us are messed up and screwed up in our teenage years and in our 20s. It's part of it. That's what we are. But the big, huge difference, I might have got crap therapists, but they weren't telling me to go off and do some sort of medical thing. You know, the big, huge difference is the specter of you know, surgery and hormonal interventions that just was just a huge layer of difference for you guys. Helena, you look like you were going to come in there on something there a minute ago. You're not
Oh,
so
I was
sure.
just kind of agreeing about the bad experiences with therapists. And I guess like something that I was actually talking about on Twitter last night, because I was getting in my feelings about it, was
Yeah.
how if anybody's like unfamiliar with my story, when I was on testosterone, I actually had just like a very bad reaction to it. And it gave me just some really terrible mental health symptoms that actually put me in a danger to myself and others. And I was hospitalized twice in like a mental health hospital over this. And like my entire experience with every mental health professional that I had during the years that I was trans, like none of them even mentioned the testosterone might be an issue. Like that was never, they diagnosed me with a bunch of different mental illnesses and prescribed me 4 different freaking psychiatric drugs, which like I was in such a bad place, I ended up abusing some of them. And like, it was just like a total fucking disaster in my life. Absolutely such a dark time. But it's like, what the hell is our mental health institution? It's not like, and I've said before, like, it's not like it's just one psychiatrist or one therapist who did this. It's freaking everybody. It was everybody at the hospital. It was everybody at my outpatient program. I probably interacted with like 10 different psychiatrists, like,
Wow.
and nobody ever brought up that, oh, okay, you're an 18-year-old girl on 100 milligrams a week of testosterone. Maybe this is causing your breakdowns. No, it was just, I was just told I was mentally ill and I needed to be on 4 different medications for life.
Oh my God. And from what I can remember of you, you were in at 18 and you said to the nurse, as if you were the doctor, oh, I've low estrogen, give me top dose. And they did. Is that right, Helena?
Yeah, and that's what happened at my appointment when I went to get the testosterone when I was 18. Like, she was gonna start me on a lower dose, but then I, just being like so naive and ignorant, I said like, oh, well, I want to go on a higher dose because I think that I have extra estrogen, so I'm gonna need more testosterone to like give me the body that I want. And she was basically just like, okay. And then we had a conversation and she ended up prescribing me 100 milligrams, which is on the higher end of what people usually start out with. Some people might end up at 100 milligrams after moving up from a lower dose, but like to start on 100 milligrams is kind of, I haven't met anybody else who has had that experience, at least.
And you're a
Can I
doctor.
just ask
Oh, you're-
Helena, like, did you inject your own testosterone or did you have to get it injected by a nurse?
I injected it,
And they just gave you the full vial and were like, here you go.
basically. And I remember like, I was so like, oh my God, I was just so naive and just like not in a good place. So I would like fill up the vial even more, just being like, oh, I just need more testosterone because it's like I hate my body so much. I just want it to change. I just need more testosterone. So I was probably injecting like, Lord knows how much testosterone.
Wow.
Yeah, I did the
Yeah.
exact same thing because initially when I got my vial, my testosterone was sustained 250, and they were like, we're going to give you the whole vial, but you're only supposed to inject half. But of course, I was out of my damn mind. I was like, more testosterone will make me a man quicker. So of course I was
Yeah.
injecting. Like, there was no supervision. There was no,
Yeah.
like, and then you'd go for your blood work and they'd be like, everything looks fine. Do you want a higher dose? Even though your mental health is plummeted. And it was like,
Yeah.
on paper, it was like we saw this patient and spoke to this patient, but in the actual appointment, there was nothing. There was no safeguarding, there was no care, there was no inspection, there was nothing. And I think, people will bring out these files in these studies where it's like, we saw these patients and we spoke to them and we had all these appointments. If you actually speak to the people who attended them, it was like, there was no medical questions. I used to go for my blood checks and she'd be like, how's uni going? I'm like, fine. She's like, right, see you in a couple of months. That's all it was. There was no intense mental health check or talk therapy. It didn't happen.
I didn't even get blood work when I was prescribed testosterone. They didn't even test my blood hormones or anything. They were just like, okay, here you go. And they said that like, because the clinic that I went to was a Planned Parenthood, their official policy was to, for the first appointment, they take the blood work and then they wait for the blood work to come back. And then you come in to get your first injection after a week or two. But they were like, oh, you seem so sure and you've come such a long way that we're just going to not do the blood work because it's not necessary anyway. And also here's this massive dose of testosterone.
Yeah, my
Carol, what were you
experience
gonna
was
say?
the same, pretty much with testosterone, and Planned Parenthood was my provider, and they are the biggest provider in the United States of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like they
Grace-
gave me a 3-month supply, just like a vial
Yep.
that was a 3-month supply. So there's no like, and there was no follow-up either. Like I had a phone call follow-up 2 weeks after the appointment, but after that, I just never heard from them again. So it's like, yeah, that's just kind of the average Planned Parenthood experience.
I went into Planned Parenthood for about a year, 2 or 3. I was having really bad vaginal atrophy, and I went in to Planned Parenthood to get care for that. And they basically said they'd never heard of such a thing. They didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And they said, here, we're going to get you some information. And they went and they got me a number to a plastic surgeon to get genital reconstruction
no.
surgery or whatever, basically to get lower surgery,
What?
to get sex change surgery. I was like, oh, this is not helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I wasn't even told about vaginal
No, no,
atrophy or
no.
anything either.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Neither was I.
That wasn't mentioned.
And yet it's a very common feature. What about yourself, Grace?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so just talking about like people feeling, scared to go back to therapists and like doctors, like it's a huge feeling of institutional betrayal. That's this phrase that people use for like, betrayal from something bigger than just one person. It's like this whole system, like Helena said. And I got informed consent hormones. I, checked off my informed consent checklist, but I went back. I went back later and I was like, hey, so I read like the most widely used standards of care, which are the WPATH standards of care. And they said that you're supposed to provide all these assessments for like autism and eating disorders and depression and stuff. And they really recommend that you offer all this stuff. Like you said you follow WPATH, like why didn't you do any of this for me? Or why didn't you at least tell me about it? Like, what is going on here? And they were just like, well, we just would rather really err on the side of not doing that. I was like, okay, great. Well, thanks for nothing, I guess. Like, just is so frustrating because, you're realizing that these providers are basically, they're very ideologically captured. They think that they're doing the right thing, but they're making these choices to do absolutely nothing in the way of mental health support. And it's shocking to see it rolled out on such a wide scale after I've been hurt by it and seen other people hurt by it as well.
Well, there's no money to be made off of offering people mental health.
Yeah. Like, can you all remember the first time you went to a therapist or counselor and brought up or even just insinuated that you were dealing with transition regret? Can you remember their faces? Because I remember mine. Like, you go in and you're like, I'm starting to have some doubts, and the wall came up, and you're like, you're supposed to be a clinically neutral health provider. What, to this day, I'm not including you, Stella, because I haven't like been to you as a patient. I've been spoken to you and blah, blah, blah. But I've never visited a hospital or my GP or the health group that I was referred to. I've never went for treatment, and so far, not yet, I haven't met someone that wasn't ideologically captured. And I've been detransitioned for over 2.5 years. It's just not there.
This is a broken system. This whole gender therapist, if you want to call them that, whatever the hell they are, it's just broken. It's not working. It's not serving people. It's not looking after people at all. To finish this part of the discussion, is there anything you would like to say that you think people need to know? I'll just ask each one of you. Is there anything you'd like to say that you think people need to know about detransition, or what is important, or maybe a myth that needs to be exploded, anything like that? Yeah, Carol?
So I think the biggest takeaway with transition regret, if you're detransitioning because of regret, is that the person, that transition was traumatic for them. That whole transition and the detransitioning is going to might be one of the most traumatic things they've ever been through. And that has to be acknowledged, and that has to have that kind of care from mental health professionals and from doctors. That has to be understood. You can't just slap a new pair of tits on them and send them out the door. That's not going to help, which is the answer I got from Kaiser. I said, I want to detransition, and you guys gave me the shit, and I want you to go ahead and you basically fix it, kind of. And without batting an eye, well, we can get you in for breast reconstruction. No, I don't want that, Wow. So, I mean, it really is, they think they can just, like your Mr. Potato Head here, we can just, put on some new parts and you're good to go. It's not, it's a trauma. It is a trauma that you're going to carry with you the rest of life. That doesn't mean you're not going to heal from it. It doesn't mean you're not going to be much happier down the road, because I am, but it's still there. Still something you went through.
Utter betrayal.
I'll go next if you want. I think, like, for me, if I if I was able to sit down with a large group of people who were in the mental health or medical field, or the people who actually had a say in what they did with people like us, as much as I would love them to know a lot about detransition, and certainly in the coming years, they're going to have to, they're not going to have a choice about that. But if I had things my way, I would go back into the past and I would talk about preventative techniques. You know, there's been so many people who've transitioned who they shouldn't have. They shouldn't have been facilitated in that. We're examples here. And so for me, I think it would be when you have, for example, a young woman who is struggling with a plethora of other issues. Maybe she's depressed, maybe she's anxious, maybe she's struggling with other things like eating disorders and things like that. How could you possibly look at a young woman with all of these issues and decide to just put them aside because gender's been put on the table and hand this young woman irreversible cross-sex hormones? How could you do that in good conscience? I don't understand. And I know that everyone's being fed this stuff about trans is beautiful and brave and stunning and it's your authentic self. Yeah, if you actually have gender dysphoria, but what about the absolutely massive surge that we've seen? Even GIDS themselves in the UK have had to come out and admit that this is an absolutely unprecedented surge. They've never seen it. It was always a very small group of older men, and now you're seeing this abundance of teenage girls and young women, many of whom are lesbian or gay, many of whom are autistic, many of whom come from foster care, and a whole host of other stuff. How dare you? How dare you sit those women down and hand them cross-sex hormones and double mastectomies as if that's nothing? So I think rather than telling people this is how you treat detransitioners, I want that. But I don't want more detransitioners. I want less. And in order for that to happen, we actually need to treat people with gender dysphoria properly. And the affirmative model that we've adopted so far is disgusting. And that's what needs to change.
Well,
Wow, can we get a round of applause here?
you got me there. You got me. What about Grace? Would you like to say something? And then after that, Helena. And then we'll move on to Ali and her piece.
Yeah, I would just say if you are a detransitioner or have a detransitioner in your life, I know how completely, shattering an experience it can be, and how it can feel like your life is ruined. And I think that everyone here has probably struggled with those feelings to some extent, but I definitely know that there is life after detransition. As Carol said, it's something that you'll carry with you forever, but I never want to see someone like succumbing to despair. So I just think that, especially given that institutions are so ideologically captured on this issue, it's just really important that, people try to be there for each other and to support the detransitioners in their life through what's probably a really hard time, and to just try to hold out hope, because I truly believe that you can recover from it.
Oh, that's lovely. And Helena?
A big point of mine is just kind of what my presentation was about, where we are really, as someone very aptly put it in the chat, someone said, doctors are concretizing transient obsessions. And that is very true, I think, for many of us here, where really we were either very young or in a vulnerable point in our lives, and we just got hooked on this idea, whether it's because we watched YouTube videos or we read too much gay fan fiction or whatever. We just kind of got hooked on this idea that we were always meant to be boys or girls, and all of our problems stem from the fact that we were assigned the wrong gender at birth, and it's all going to be amazing, and we're going to have trans joy when we transition. And like, you're just like, when you transition a person like that, like, you are making something concrete, you are damaging them, you are harming them for life based on something that they would have grown out of or overcome without like the permanent damage. So
Brilliant, thank you. Before I welcome in Ali, for her presentation. And thank you very much for this Detrans 101. I think it was very, very powerful from all of you. I think you're all right about the therapists. I think you have been failed by the medical profession. And I think it's easy for somebody like me who was so mad so many different times in my life. And, I've always known, the mind can make a hell, a heaven out of hell and a hell out of heaven. There's no doubt about it. And we can every one of us can get stuck on things. And it's just so unfair that your stuck got interpreted into a medical situation that, you just didn't. It wasn't fair.